Hello, welcome to a gorgeous setting in the south coast of New South Wales in Australia. We're at Rosedale. In the background you can see gum trees and the sea. I'm Joan Corbett and I am intending to record a number of short videos about my family. I grew up in Australia along with my sister and two brothers, the four children of David and Pat Corbett. And since I retired, I've been reading about my grandparents, Percy and Margaret Corbett. So that's where I'm starting with some family history. This short video with some photographs is primarily about Percy Corbett, my grandfather, who I only met a couple of times because our lives in Australia meant that only short visits back to Canada, where he and Margaret lived, were possible. So we'll start with a bit of biography of Percy. Percy Corbett was born on Prince Edward Island and grew up as part of a big Scottish Presbyterian family. His father was a Presbyterian minister and worked in various parts of Canada. There's a wonderful book written by one of Percy's brothers, Ed Corbett, about Father, God bless him, which tells about their childhood and growing up. And from that I've learned that the education and raising of this family of 8 siblings was quite a interesting part of Canadian history. They moved from small town to small town, and they had a schooling that was in pretty small rural locations. Nonetheless, Percy was a very successful student, and when he finished school he continued to university and gained degrees from McGill University until the start of the Great War. So the photo that you just saw of Percy is the only one we have from that time as far as I know, and it is related to what we know of his time in the trenches in France and in the Great War. He had been awarded a Rhodes Scholarship before the war started and wasn't able to take that up and go to Oxford until after the war finished in 1918. So, First World War story. He was awarded medals for some of his heroic acts in the war, but didn't talk a lot about it because I think there were too many also traumatic things that happened then. After the war and in his Oxford years, Percy wrote some interesting short pieces about life in Oxford and his comparison of Canadian universities to Oxford. And these have now been transcribed and are available. I have copies of them and will intend to put them online. He, at this stage, also met again Margaret Morrison, who was in Paris teaching, and they had been at McGill at the same time but had not become friends there. However, in the Oxford years, they not only became friends, but indeed married and stayed married for the rest of their quite long lives. So Margaret Morrison enters the picture in the years in Oxford between 1919 and when Percy moved back to Canada. They married in 1921. Hi, still at Rosedale. Sea in the background, but indoors now. It's a little later in my day. And I'm just about to run through some of the career notes for Percy. So here we go. Following his war service, his Rhodes Scholarship, he was made a Fellow at All Souls College in Oxford in 1920, and he returned to Canada to McGill University in, I think, about 1927. So by then he was married, and indeed there were two children along the way, David and Helen, both born in the 1920s. He became a legal officer in the International Labour Office in the League of Nations in Geneva. And so he worked with the League of Nations both in his time in Europe and, I believe, when he was connected to McGill University. So he served as the Dean of the Faculty of Law at McGill from 1928 to 1936. And there was a brief period where he also acted as principal of the university. And there's an account of that in the McGill story written by A.J. Hobbins. There's a reference to that on the website. In 1938, he had some work relationship with Australia, and this is probably where he met P.D. Phillips, who was our mother, Patricia Corbett's father. He was given an honorary doctorate in 1938 by Melbourne University. And from then on, his academic career spanned a number of Canadian and American universities. So he moved to Yale University in 1943 as the Chair, Department of Political Science, and Professor of Government and Jurisprudence. And he took out American citizenship. There's a story here, not too clear, but one that my father David believed was about Percy's dissatisfaction with some policy decisions in Canada and his feeling that the Americans had a better approach on issues that were dear to him. Whatever, he became an American and never returned to live in Canada. He lectured in various places in the United States, including the Centre for International Studies at Princeton, and he was a visitor to The Hague in 1954, to California in 1956, to New Delhi in 1958-59. So he had an international reputation in his field of international relations, and he was passionate about a number of issues, including the need for global action on issues like addressing poverty and addressing reconstruction after war. He became Emeritus Professor of Yale University in 1958, and the rest of his career was spent at various universities, including University of Virginia and at Lehigh in Pennsylvania. He regularly visited Canada, and for the last years of his life, following the death of Margaret, he lived just across the border from Canada, where his daughter Helen Little was still living in Quebec. So they were really only miles apart, but he chose not to return to live in Canada.